Okay, well, thank you very much, Ray Kelman, and to Tara and Moshe. It's always a pleasure to get to teach. I've said a few times, one of the few upsides of the craziness we live in is that Zoom shiurim have become the norm. So now I'm able to, connect and reconnect with people in general and through Torah around the world. And it's always good to reconnect with the Toronto community. So for the last year, I've been teaching my students a series on tefillah. Last year we focused on Shema Always, on the Amidah, on the daily prayers. We got cut short a little bit during some of the craziness, where even though we stayed open, not every class was at the normal time. But over the summer, I started working a bit on Shema. So I thought I would start by running by some of my initial ideas as I go through Shema in this setting. So what we're going to do over the next 3 weeks is examine 3 themes that I think permeate the entirety of Shema. Obviously, the Shema is, as it appears in our Siddur, in the liturgy, is not identical to the way that it appears in the Torah. The first paragraph of the Shema liturgy, Shema and V'ahavta, appears in Dvarim Perek Vav, in chapter 6. And the second paragraph in Dvarim Perek Yud Aleph, in chapter 11. And the third paragraph is in Parshat Shlach, in Bamidbar. So it's not one unit in the Torah, but as a unit of liturgy, it is unified. While on a halachic level there are debates as to whether all of these paragraphs are biblical, or none of them are biblical, or one is biblical, or 2 are biblical. We're going to approach this the way we experience it. The Shema, in all of its parts, is one of the most famous parts of the liturgy. The first verse, especially, is known by pretty much anyone with even the most basic of Jewish education. The first verse, and there are plenty of stories of people who, as they died, even if they knew nothing else about Judaism, the words of Shema were on their lips. But even the other paragraphs are relatively well known. So what we're going to try to do is explore the themes of this central part of our liturgy. Over the summer, I also had the opportunity to read, and we'll explore a piece from this next week. Rabbi Lamb, Zechrono Livracha, who passed away only a few weeks ago, wrote an entire book on Shema, just in the first paragraph, and used it as a key to explore key philosophical concepts in Judaism, because Shema really is this central text. And as I once heard from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, and it is in the introduction, I believe, to the Siddur, Judaism, traditional ancient Judaism, wasn't very good at writing philosophical works. We didn't write systematic works because most people don't read them. So the things that became central to the philosophy of the average Jew were those things that made it into the Siddur, that made it into the liturgy. And if you want to understand the basic philosophy of Judaism, you don't look at the medieval treatises on philosophy. You go back to the Siddur, which was meant for every Jew to read on a daily basis and really inculcate those key values into their lived experience. And as I said, Shema, being one of these central texts, is a great place to start. So, with that, let's jump in to the first theme. So I'll share my screen. I've also sent out the sources, and they're available on the page for the class also. Okay. So I called the first year Shema Always and Forever. So what I want to do is read the first paragraph, which is, as I've said, most of you probably know quite well. I want to read it carefully, and I want to focus on the following question. Right? Shema captures some of the central themes of Judaism. The belief in God, the obligation to love God, the belief that God is one. But it also includes several mitzvot, right? Several commandments. And I want you to pay attention to the particular commandments that make it in to the first paragraph, both the substance of the commandments, but also the way that they're presented. And I want to try to think if there's a theme that connects all of them, and what that will teach us about the central theses of Judaism and the mitzvot that are critical to ensuring that those beliefs become part of a lived Jewish life. So, these first verses, as I said, most people are probably familiar with them. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Right? Listen, hear, O Israel, God, our God, the Lord our God, is one. V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha b'chol nafshecha b'chol me'odecha. And you shall love God with all your heart, and all your soul, and all your me'od, your might, your wealth, your muchness, however you want to translate that phrase. V'hayu advarim ha'eleh. And these words, unclear what those words are talking about. In the classic sources in the Talmud, it's divided. Sometimes it refers to the words of Shema. Sometimes it refers more broadly to the words of Torah. Rabbi Lam notes that in most halachic contexts, Chazal take this phrase as referring to Shema. In most hashkafic and most philosophical contexts, the Gemara takes this phrase as referring to the totality of Torah. V'hayu advarim ha'ileh. These words, whatever they are, asher anochi mitzavcha hayom, which I command you today, al levavecha, they should be on your heart. V'shinantam levanecha, and you shall teach them to your children. Though we have this strange word v'shinantam, it's not teach, it's make sure that they are sharp, or repeat them to your children. V'dibarta bam, and speak in them. B'shivtecha b'veitecha v'lechlecha v'derech u'v'shachvecha u'v'kumecha. Speak in them when you sit in your home, when you walk on the way, when you're lying down, when you stand up. Ukshartem la'od al yadecha v'ayul todafot b'neinecha. Tie them onto your arms, and there'll be a sign between your eyes, which traditionally understood refers to the mitzvah of tefillah. Uchtavtam al mezuzot beitecha v'yisharecha. And write these words on the doorpost of your house, in the mitzvah that we know as mezuzah. So this is the first parak. This is the first chapter of Shema. So, again, I know that we know this text, but if we think about the philosophical ideas and the commandments that are listed in this paragraph, let's think for a moment what appears here and what might be the common denominator between everything that appears here. So I see I have one chat. Feel free to chat, or on, there's the sources. Feel free to chat if you see a common denominator. Or you can unmute yourself, I guess, if that's possible. I'm not sure if it is, but if it is, it's not possible. So then feel free to chat. Okay. So if you want, you can feel free to chat. I'll give it a second. Otherwise, we will continue here. Okay. So, before we... Oh, I got one suggestion. Well, let's see. Did I say... Can't have belief without action. Very good. Okay, so I see here a few suggestions. That there's constancy, right? That you can't have belief without action. Does hakeh et shinav allude to vishinantam? That is possible in the Haggadah. Okay, let me focus here on the first two points that are made. So, two suggestions here that I want to pick up on are, one, that what seems to emerge clearly from this paragraph is that the notion that you can have belief without action is not present here, right? There is no, even though we talk about this paragraph as delineating key beliefs about the existence of God, His oneness, the framing of the paragraph highlights that it seems to be much more about action. And I think that is 100% true. Rabbi Lam has several chapters on this, and he notes that basically you have three ways of taking this paragraph. whether it's focusing on action or belief. You have people like the Rambam, Maimonides, who focus on belief. You have people like Shadal, who deny that this paragraph really has anything to do with belief and thinks that everything here is about action, and denies that love of God is fundamentally emotional. It's more about the actions that express love. Right? If you think in terms of like a spousal relationship, right? The love here is not in your head saying, I love my wife, I love my husband. It's the daily actions you do to express that. Or, as Rabbi Lamb notes in many Rishonim, it's that synthesis of true emotion that manifests in action, but action seems to be critical. And the second point that was raised in the chat was that all these mitzvot seem to focus in some way or another on the notion of constancy, of consistency or constancy. And I think that is a very sharp point, and that's the one I want to begin to develop. So for this, I turn here to source 2. So the Talmud in Menachot Daf Tzaditet is having a relatively technical discussion. I'll say it outside and then explain how it relates to our point. So one of the mitzvot, one of the commandments in the temple, in the Beit HaMikdash, is the lechem hapanim, is the showbread that would stand on the shulchan, on the table in the Beit HaMikdash. And once a week, it would be replaced. And the Talmud debates how one has to replace it. So the reason that there's a dispute is that the Torah says that when the bread has to be on the shulchan, has to be on the table, it has to be lefanai tamid. It has to be in front of God always. So the Talmud cites a debate as to what this always mandates. So the Gemara tells us that there were 2 opinions. The first opinion says that what would have to happen is that the priests who were coming in, the Kohanim who were coming in, would have to stand there with the bread, and as they were about to take the old bread off, they would stand there with the new bread and they would do a quick switch. So there wouldn't be a second where the bread was not on the table. Rabbi Yossi says it's not true. Rabbi Yossi says it doesn't matter. The first group of priests can come and take off the old bread, and the second group can take the bread and they can put it on. You don't have to do this quick switch. If it takes a few minutes, no big deal. That is also called tamid. Now, in source 3, and then we'll come back to what this tells us in a minute, the Talmud tells us that this debate isn't just about the showbread, but it speaks to a much bigger concept of the value of this word tamid, which means always, and spills over to many other areas of halacha. You know what? Before I go to that, what do you think the dispute is between these 2 positions? Right? We have one position who says, if the bread has to be on the table tamid, always, so you need to stand there and do this quick switch, there's not a second where the bread doesn't appear on the table. And Rabbi Yossi says, as the Gemara will explain, it doesn't matter, as long as every day the bread is on the table, that's considered tamid. And even if you put the new bread in the morning, and you take off the old bread in the morning and put the new bread in the afternoon, that would still be considered always. Right? So what's the debate? Right? The Torah tells us the bread must be on the table tamid, always. And here you have this dispute. Does the bread have to be there every second or every day? Right? What is the debate? What are they arguing about? So I once heard from Mori Varabi, from Rav Lichtenstein, Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, that there's really a very simple English way to understand their dispute. In Hebrew, the word tamid simply means always. But in English, we actually have two words that both sort of mean always, but have very different connotations. And what the Talmud is debating is which of these two always are we talking about? And they are constant or consistent. Right? Something can be always if it's constant, meaning literally every second, but we also talk about things that are always as being consistent. So for example, if someone says, I always have coffee first thing in the morning, they don't mean that they have coffee 24 hours a day. They mean they consistently have a coffee when they wake up. Right? That's one type of always. If someone says, you always need to be breathing in order to survive, they mean literally always. Right? I always need to be bringing oxygen in and expelling carbon dioxide, or I would die. Both of those, we use the word always, but one of them is really consistent, and one of them is constant. And the Talmud seems to be debating, when we talk about this notion of tamid, which one do we mean? The first position with the bread is that it always needs to be there, meaning constantly. So if I'm taking off the bread, I got to be sliding in the new bread so that it's there constantly. And Rabbi Yossi said it's enough that it's there every day. It needs to be there consistently. And what Rav Luchenstein noted is that both of these types of tamid, right, integrate into our lives. The things that are most important we do always, but some of those we do constantly, some of them we do consistently. But the point is that those things which are always in our life are the ones that really define the contours of the way we live. And for that reason, even though this discussion begins with a sort of technical detail in the laws of the temple, the Talmud extends it to many other things. If you look at 3, we'll read the English here, the Talmud tells you that the Mishnah teaches that according to Rabbi Yossi, even if the priest first removes the old showbread entirely, and then places the new showbread upon the table, this fulfills the requirement, showbread always be on the table. Moreover, it is taught in a Braita that Rabbi Yossi says even if the priest removed the old showbread in the morning of Shabbat and arranged the new showbread toward evening, there's nothing wrong with that. Rather, how do I realize the meaning of the verse, and you shall set upon the table showbread before me always? This means that the table should not be left overnight without bread upon it. Right? So we have this constant versus consistent dispute. But then the Talmud expands it, and it says, Rabbi Ami says, from Rabbi Yossi's statement, we may learn that even if a person learned only one chapter of the Mishnah in the morning and one chapter of the Mishnah in the evening, he has thereby fulfilled the mitzvah of the Torah scroll shall not depart from your mouth. The Talmud then says there's a mitzvah, there's a commandment to always be learning Torah, but once Rabbi Yossi tells you that always doesn't always mean constant, sometimes it means consistent. So, we learn from this, we derive from this, that it's enough to learn a little bit during the morning, a little bit during the night, and that's enough to say that Torah is a consistent part of your life. But then, Reb Shimon Bar Yochai goes even farther, and he says, if you wanted to outline the absolute minimum amount of Torah you need to study per day to say that you have Torah as a consistent part of your life, what would it be? So Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, even if a person recited only the recitation of Shema in the morning and the evening, he has fulfilled the mitzvah of this scroll shall not depart from your mouth. Right? If I only had the opportunity to express my commitment through Torah study in the most minimal fashion that would still define me as someone consistently defined in Torah, the minimum amount would be Shema, would be the recitation of Shema, which in addition to being liturgy is a verse from the Torah. So what I think though you see in this source is that the Torah, what starts as a very technical conversation about the nature of the karbanot, the nature of the sacrifices, the Talmud then expands to a discussion of what does one need in their life in a consistent basis to ensure that the Torah is part of your life. And the Talmud's answer is Shema, which is built into our day in a consistent fashion, is the absolute minimum that you need in order to have Torah a part of your life. But what that also hints at is that one of the key features that makes Shema so powerful is this fact that it is tamid, is that it is by definition consistent, because the obligation is one which happens every day, twice a day, in both parts of our lived experience, the morning and the night, the day and the night. And that seems to be central to understanding the key of Shema. And if you look at number 4, the Avudraham, which is one of the central medieval studies of the Siddur, of the liturgy, he expands this. And he notes that this notion of tamid, of consistent / constant, manifests itself no less than 10 times just in the first paragraph of Shema. And he writes, Od timtza asara mitzvot aseh kvuot b'parsha zo. If you look at this first paragraph, you will discover 10 set established mitzvot. What are they? Achat, Kabbalat o Malchut Shamayim. The first is the acceptance of the yoke of heaven. Shne'emar Hashem Elokeinu. As we say, the Lord is our God. Shenit, Yichud Hashem, Shne'emar Hashem Echad. The second is the belief that God is one. As we say, God is one. Shlishit, Ahavat Hashem. Shne'emar V'ahavta Hashem Elokecha. The third is the love of God. As it says, and you shall love God. Revi'it, the fourth, Talmud Torah, is Torah study. Shne'emar v'dibarta bam. Chamishit, the fifth is Limud Banim, is the teaching of children. Shne'emar v'shinantem levanecha. Shishit u'shvi'it, the sixth and seventh, is the recitation of Shema in the morning and in the evening. Shminit u'tshi'it, the eighth and ninth, are tefillin shel yad v'shel rosh, are the tefillin which originally were worn all day and now are worn at least daily. And asirit mezuzah, and the 10th is mezuzah, which is always on our house. And the Avudraham writes that if you read carefully, you'll discover that in the short verses that we have in Shema, we have no less than 10 values that are expressed, and the common denominator between all of them is that, to put it in the terms we were using before, they express both kinds of tamid, both kinds of always, consistency and constancy. And more recently, this has been developed by Rabbi Michael Hatton. I put an article by him in number 5, Toronto native, I believe. There we go, Toronto native. As well, and I put a long citation of it. I'm not going to read it all inside, but I gave it to you to explore because it's really an excellent piece. But let's talk about what he says outside. And he says it's not just that these 10 mitzvot happen to be things you do all the time. But if you think about it carefully, it's more than that. So let's think about Torah. Sure, the mitzvah of teaching Torah is daily. Sure, the pasuk in Yoshua says, "V'higita b'yom u'balayla." You shall delve into it, you shall ponder it, morning and night. But if you think about the particular expression of that commandment in this paragraph, it's much more than that. Because it's Vishinantem Livanecha. So let's analyze every part of that. First of all, it doesn't say teach, Ulimadtem, or Vilimadtem. It says Vishinantem. Now Vishinantem literally means you shall learn through repetition. Right? You shall learn through repetition. Which means that not only do we talk about Torah, which by definition is a daily mitzvah, but we choose a verb that expresses the most constant way you could learn Torah, which is by repeating it. Furthermore, and now he doesn't focus on this, but I would add, we say, Vishinantem livanecha. We talk not about just teaching, but we talk about repetitive teaching to our children, which adds yet another element of this constancy or consistency model, because it adds the notion of intergenerational continuity. Right? It's not just that the Torah study that we talk about in Shema is one which is constant in our own lives, but it's constant generationally, because we talk about teaching Torah to the next generation. And the truth is that it's even more than that. I think I included this later on, but I don't know if we'll have time to read it inside. But the Talmud adds in Kedushin Daf Lamed and Kedushin 30a that from Vishinantem we learn that the way you're supposed to know Torah is in a way that it becomes completely part of your personality. And therefore the Gemara makes the following derivation. Vishinantem sheyihyu hadvarim mechudadim bificha. Shinun can also mean sharp. So the Talmud says you should study Torah in a way that it's sharp in your mouth. Shem shalcha lecha adam davar, so that if someone would ask you a question, al tzarech legamgeim, you wouldn't have to stutter. El omer lo miyad, you would be able to say it immediately. Meaning that Vishinantem for Chazal isn't just learn Torah, it's know Torah so well that it's second nature. I remember once I was in Rav Lichtenstein's shir, and sometimes if we didn't know things well enough, he wasn't so happy with us. So he once, when it was evident that no one in shir really knew what was going on, or to his standards, he said, I'll say it in Hebrew first, but I'll translate. He says, "Katuv b'Gemara v'shinantem shiyu divrei Torah mechudadim b'ficha shem yishalcha lecha adam davar al tzarich lingamgem el omer lo miyad ve'atem afilu lo itchaltem lingamgem." Right? He said the Torah says you have to know the Torah well enough that if someone asks you a question, you have to stutter. You haven't even begun stuttering. Right? And it's even to know it, a little bit is impressive, but to know it to the point where you don't stutter, where someone asks you a question and it just explodes out of you, it's second nature, that describes a type of Torah learning which is much more integrated into the very fabric of your personality. So the first point I would make about Torah is that besides the fact that Torah by definition is a daily mitzvah, the way that Shema frames Torah is that you should know it so sharp that you don't have to stutter. It's second nature to you. It uses the word that doesn't mean study, but means study with repetition, and it adds an intergenerational link by saying you should teach your children. So it emphasizes this notion of constancy and consistency over generations, integrated into your personality in several ways. There are other ways as well. The Talmud derives from them, Vishilashtem, that your Talmud study should be complete. It should include understanding of Mikra, right, of Tanakh, of Mishnah, of Talmud, right? So there's also a completeness that's implied here. In terms of Talmud Torah, elsewhere in the Gemara, maybe we'll see it later, the Talmud says what it means is you should always be talking in Torah, that's Lo yeh diburcha elabam, your speaking should only be in Torah, but all these things emphasize this notion of always, constant and consistent. Now Shema, we already talked about, but if you think about the way the Gemara, the Psukim phrase it, you say it always. When you wake up and you go to sleep. Right? When we talk about someone who lives and breathes something, right? It's what he's thinking about when he wakes up and he's thinking about when he goes to sleep. That's the imagery we use of someone who's obsessed, of something that defines your life. And that's the way we talk about Shema. And to be fair, Chazal add to this, that even though the biblical mitzvah of Shema is in the morning at night, Chazal add that the last thing you say before you go to sleep should be Shema again. Right? Which seems to feed into this notion that the recitation of Shema is about this always, constant, consistent, define your life by saying the Shema. Tefillin. So, traditionally, in the time of the Talmud, it was worn all day. Because all the time you were supposed to have something bound to your arm and on your head that reminded you of God. Now, we don't do that. We wear it only once a day because we have a hard time concentrating. But the fact that originally tefillin was supposed to be on your head, which tells you that your thoughts are directed towards God, and on your arm, which teaches that your actions should be dedicated to God, and it is tilted towards your heart to indicate that your emotions should be dedicated to God, and you are wearing that all day, that further highlights the centrality of this all-embracing, constant commitment that is represented in this first paragraph. Mezuzah, which is on our house, which is on at least in a fully Jewish state, isn't just on your private house, but is on the gates of the city, that whenever you walk in and out of your house, you're reminded of God because you have something that stands there with God's name. Again, is all-inclusive, always, constant, always on your house. I remember when I moved into my house here, so it was ready the day before Rosh Hashanah, so we did not move in that day. We stayed by friends for Rosh Hashanah, but we moved in the day after Rosh Hashanah, which is also a fast day, and it also turned out to be the day of my nephew's bris. So I have this memory. We drove to Petach Tikva, and the way we had the bris, because it was a fast day, was we had the bris right before sunset, and then the meal was the breakfast. So it's already late at night. It finishes like 10, 11 o'clock at night, and then I drive back the hour plus to Efrat. I get home, and I can't live in my house without mezuzah. So I carry my kids in, throw them in bed, and then my wife and I took out the mezuzahs. We found a sofer who delivered the mezuzahs to the bris and dropped them off, and I get back at 11 o'clock at night. Before I can go to sleep, I have to go to every doorway in my house and bang in the mezuzah, because that is the mitzvah of mezuzah. I can't sleep in my house if that mezuzah isn't on the door. Now, obviously, some of the other mitzvot are obvious like this. The mitzvah to love God. Love is something which is constant, almost by definition. And it seems to be that when taken together, the key to understanding Shema is this notion that you need consistency and constancy, or both forms of alwaysness, as it were, in order for Shema to work. And to push it a little farther, what I think that gets at is something that we talked about towards the beginning. That if Shema is about our committing ourselves to believing in God, to loving God, philosophical ideas are very nice. But if they aren't manifest, if they aren't expressed in life, then they don't mean anything and they fade. And we know that's true in our human relationships also. I don't know how many times I've seen this parable used between rabbinic sources and in marriage self-help books, right? But if you have someone who says, I love my spouse, and all day long they sit there in a room and say, I love my wife, I love my wife, I love my wife, and then his wife comes in and says, honey, can you do the dishes? And he says, no, I'm contemplating how much I love you, I don't have time to do the dishes, right? You say that's not real love, right? If it's just theoretical, it doesn't express itself in those little things that you have to do all the time, A, it's not real, and B, it won't last, right? There's this reinforcing mechanism that love needs to be expressed in action to be real, and the more you express your love in action, the more that reinforces the emotion and the deeper it becomes. And Shema, I think, is teaching us the same thing. you want to know the secret to living a life that's actually infused with the belief in God and the love of God, then you've got to manifest that self. You've got to express that love all the time. You have to wear it proudly on your head, on your arm. You have to dedicate your mind, your thoughts, your emotions, your actions to God. It needs to be on your house. You need to teach your children, because you need to, if you really believe it, the values you hold dearest, you pass to the next generation. It's not just enough to speak about it, but you got to repeat it. It needs to be integrated into your personality, so that the Torah is the thing you talk about all the time. If someone asks you a question, it just overflows out of you, because you're always thinking about God and His mitzvot and the lifestyle that He's given to you to express your relationship with Him. And I think that this explains something fascinating. And this is a point that Rav Shimon Schwab makes in his book on prayer. And he notes the following. He says, some of the mitzvot mentioned in Shema are cardinal mitzvot, or ones which you're obligated to give up your life for. And Chazal see in the phrase of loving God b'chol nafshecha that you have to give up your life if, for example, someone wants to force you to worship idolatry. But some of the other mitzvot there are not. Right? They're not mitzvot that you have to give up your life for, like tefillin or mezuzah. And yet he notes that if you go through the Talmud, you'll find that every single mitzvah mentioned in this paragraph, people were willing to give up their life for, even though they weren't technically cardinal sins. Because these are the mitzvot that are vital, as he writes, to the very existence of our individual and national life. So he says, for example, let's take the most famous story. I don't know why I put this menachot again, but look at number 8. Okay, we're running short on time, so I'll say this story outside. Okay, or we'll read it in the English. And we learn the mission of the explanation of the verse, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might. This was elaborated upon, and we're going to come back to this story in more detail next week, but for now, let's just get it out there on the table. This was elaborated upon when it was taught in a Braita. Rabbi Eliezer said, if it is stated with all your soul, why does it say with all your might? Conversely, if it is stated with all your might, why does it say with all your soul? Rather, this means that if one's body is dearer to him than his property, therefore it is stated with all your soul, one must give his soul in sanctification of God. And if one's money is dearer to him than his body, then it's stated with all your might. Okay, let's skip down. Now Rabbi Akiva says, with all your soul means even if God takes your soul. And now the Gemara relates at length how Rabbi Akiva fulfilled these directives. So the sages taught, one time after the Bar Kokhba rebellion, the evil empire of Rome decreed that Israel may not engage in the study and practice of Torah. Pappus ben Yehuda came and found Rabbi Akiva, who was convening assemblies in public and engaging in Torah study. Pappus said to him, Akiva, are you not afraid of the empire? Rabbi Akiva answered him, I'll relate a parable. To what can this be compared? It's like a fox walking along a riverbank when he sees fish gathering and fleeing from place to place. The fox said to him, from what are you fleeing? They said to him, we're fleeing from the nets that people cast upon us. He said to them, do you wish to come up onto dry land and we'll reside together just as my ancestors resided with your ancestors? The fish said to him, you are the one of whom they say he's the cleverest of animals? You're not clever, you're a fool. If we're afraid in the water, our natural habitat which gives us life, then in a habitat that causes our death all the more so. The moral is, so too we Jews, now that we sit and engage in Torah study, about which is written, for this is your life and the length of your days, we fear the empire to this extent. If we proceed to sit idle from its study, as its abandonment is the habitat that causes our death, all the more so will we fear the empire. Right? So Rabbi Akiva says, you know why? I'm going to risk my life for Torah study, which is not one of the big three. Because it's like the air I breathe. Right? He says it's like the fox who says to the fish, come and be safe on land. He says, look, I understand. If I didn't study Torah, the Romans wouldn't want to kill me. But if I didn't study Torah, I'm already dead. I don't have anything to live for. I'm in danger because without Torah, I'm nothing. I'm dead. I remember once they asked Lichtenstein, why do we study? Right? Why do we study Gemara? And his response intuitively was, why do we breathe? It's just, Torah is who we are. So you see that Rabbi Akiva is willing to risk his life for Torah. It's not one of the big three technically. But Rabbi Akiva is willing to risk his life. And then, skipping to the end of the story, Rabbi Akiva does in fact get killed for this. The Romans take him and they kill him. And again, we'll come back to the details of this story next week, as they're raking off his flesh with iron combs, he dies with the words of Shema in his mouth. And a voice comes out from heaven and says, praiseworthy are you, Rabbi Akiva, that your soul left as you said the word Echad. So you see in this celebrated story of Rabbi Akiva that he dies while saying Shema, and he risks his life and gets put in this situation because he realizes that without Torah his life is nothing. In number 9, and I'll say this story outside, surprisingly we have the same type of story by Tefillin. And the Talmud in Shabbat Memtet 49 tells us the story of Rabbi Elisha Bal Knafayim. Rabbi Elisha, the man of wings. And the Talmud says, why is he called the man of wings? Because it once happened that the Romans decreed that anyone who would put on tefillin, they would pierce their brain. They would kill them. But he risked his life and put on tefillin anyways. And one day a Roman saw him wearing tefillin, so he chased him. And Elisha took off his tefillin and hid them in his hands. The Roman catches him, and he says, what's in your hands? And he says, dove feathers, dove wings. And he says, let me see. So he opens up his hands, and miraculously his tefillin had transformed into the wings of a dove. And the Gemara goes on to explain, because metaphorically the Jews are compared to a dove. But what you see in this story is that tefillin, it's not one of the cardinal mitzvot. It's not one of the big three. It's not murder, idolatry, or forbidden sexual union. But the Talmud tells a story of someone who was willing to risk his life for tefillin. And the truth is, this idea carries over into the second paragraph of Shema as well. Because the second paragraph of Shema tells us that we should serve God b'chol levavchem, with all your heart. And here, the rabbis identify what mitzvah is being discussed here is tefillah, is prayer. Now, prayer is another one of those mitzvot that we do all the time, 3 times a day. And again, prayer, formally speaking, is not one of those mitzvot that you have to give up your life for. And yet, if you look in the Mishnah in Brachot 5:1, the Mishnah tells us that even if a king greets you while praying, you shouldn't answer. And even if a snake is wound around your heel, you shouldn't stop. Which sounds like prayer is in fact a cardinal sin. Even if you're about to die because a snake is going to bite you, you should give up your life. Now the Talmud doesn't understand it this way. But, or at least it brings a dispute about this. But then it brings a story on Brachot Lamed Bet of a particular sage who was praying, and a Roman officer, here reading in the middle of the source, the sages taught that there was a related incident involving a particularly pious man who was praying while traveling along his path, when an officer, a Roman officer, came and greeted him. The pious man did not pause from his prayer, and he did not respond with a greeting. The officer waited for him until he finished his prayer. After he finished his prayer, the officer said to him, "You good for nothing. You endangered yourself. I could have killed you. Isn't it written in your Torah, take utmost care and guard yourself diligently? Don't you know that you have to take care of your life? I could have killed you for not stopping during prayer. Why are you risking your life for prayer?" So the sage says to him, "Look, if a king had come and if you were standing before a king and your friend came and said hello, would you say hello back?" The officer said, "Of course not." So he says, "Well, that's why I didn't answer you. Because I was standing before God. And therefore, I don't care if you are going to kill me." Now, in the end, that won the argument. The guy didn't give up his life. But again, you have a person who, at least the simple meaning of the Gemara, is that for prayer, which is another one of these constant mitzvot, he was willing to give up his life. And the truth is that this is the theme of the 6th chapter of the book of Daniel, of the book of Daniel, where the king sets a rule that anyone who prays or requests anything from anyone, human king, divine king, doesn't matter, for 30 days, will be thrown into the lion's den. And then the Talmud, then the Sukkim tell us that Daniel, not only does he pray, he goes to his house, goes up to the attic, opens the window for the world to see, and bows and prays towards Jerusalem, leading to the famous story of Daniel being thrown into the lion's den. Again, technically, is it a cardinal sin? No. Is it a mitzvah you should give up your life for? No. And yet you have this dramatic story in Daniel of someone willing to risk his life for prayer. And the Sefer Hasidim actually rules, based on this story and the story in Daniel, the story in the Talmud and Daniel, that prayer is something that ideally you should give up your life for. Again, this is not widely accepted halachically, but he takes these stories together and says you should. We were running low on space. I thought I put it, but I'll say the last one outside. The same is true of mezuzah. The Gemara in Avodah Zarah Yud Aleph tells us that Onkelos, Hager, Onkelos, the Aramaic translator of the Torah, converted, even though he was part of the royal Roman family, which was not a good idea. So the emperor tries to get Onkelos back, and he keeps sending officers to bring Onkelos back away from Judaism, back to Rome. And each time he comes up with some way out, and the final scene in this story of Onkelos changing his life, risking his life by deserting his Roman family, is that as he's being pulled out of his house, he touches the mezuzah. And the officers say to him, "What is that?" And he says, "Aha! That's a mezuzah." Because by the Romans, by human beings, the king is on the inside and his guards stand outside. But by God, we're his servants and we're inside, and God, who's the king, protects us on the outside. And with that inspirational speech, he convinces the officers to convert to Judaism, and they don't kill him. Instead, they join him, and the Romans give up on trying to get Onkelos. And it's fascinating that each one of these mitzvot, most of them are not technically cardinal sins. And yet, Shema, Torah, Tefillin, Mezuzah, and Tefillah, prayer, which are all these constant mitzvot, each one of them has a dramatic story in the Talmud of either someone who was willing to give up their life for it, or, in the case of Onkelos, someone who had already committed to give up his life and manages to save himself through the inspirational message of the mezuzah. And I think that this insight bolsters what we've been saying, that Shema represents the most core tenets of Judaism. Believe in God, love God. But if you want that to be real, you want to know what a life infused with those messages looks like, it's one in which God's presence is part of our life, tamid, consistently and constantly. And therefore the mitzvot that are delineated in Va'ahavta both express that love and reinforce it by telling us, teach your children Torah, day and night. Teach it till you know it so well you don't have to stutter. Repeat it over and over. Make sure that it's consistent across generations. Wrap a symbol of God on your arm, on your head, to direct your thoughts and actions and emotions to God all the time. Put something on your house that reminds you that when you walk in and out, God is there. Every one of the mitzvot that's mentioned in the first paragraph and even in the later ones emphasizes that true love can only be real if it's, again, manifested and bolstered by consistency and constancy. And therefore, those are the mitzvot that find their place in these critical 3 paragraphs of liturgy. The Rambam really says this in his closing passage in Hilchot Mezuzah, where he says that, right, don't think of the mezuzah as an amulet that just protects you because it's magic. Rather, the point is, if you have a person, as he says, who wears tefillin and wears tzitzit, which is the 3rd paragraph of Shema, and has a mezuzah on his door, and that leads him to constantly think about God, then that person won't sin. Because the key to a life of godliness is making sure that every nook and cranny, your body, your house, your mind, your children, every way in which you can make Torah and mitzvot and God complete in your life, those mitzvot that represent that type of completeness, that consistency, that constancy, that intergenerational total commitment, those are the mitzvot that show you what it means to love and what enable you to love. And that's what Shema is about. That's why it's the key to our liturgy. That's why these are the paragraphs you say every day, that you say morning and night, because it's that idea of tamid that's going to ensure that everything else will come along, that everything else is possible. And that's the key. The key is a total and complete loving relationship that manifests itself over and over in every aspect of our life, constantly and consistently. At the end, I gave you, and it's in English. I won't read it inside, but Rabbi Yehuda Amital, the other founding Rosh Yeshiva of my yeshiva, used to say this all the time. That there's a midrash that's cited by the In Yaakov and by the Maharal, that there's a debate about the most important verse in the Torah, and one of the opinions that's brought there is from Shimon ben Pazi, which is that you're supposed to bring the daily offering in the morning and the afternoon. And he always said, why is that the greatest principle in the Torah, to bring something in the morning and night? And the answer is because, more important than anything, is that whatever we do it all the time, that we're consistent in our commitment to God. That is the key to everything. Just like it's a key in our human relationships. Right? If you make sure that every time you talk to your spouse, you speak nicely, you say good morning, how are you, you say thank you, you make sure that you're taking your part of the chores, you're making sure that always, every day, you're an equal part in the marriage, then your love will deepen and your love will last. And the same thing is true of God. And that, as I said, is I think the key to understanding Shema. That it's not just some random collection of mitzvot, but the key to making sure that we live lives that attest to the fact that we believe God exists, is one, and we express and commit to loving Him, are those that make sure that our commitment is total, consistent, constant, on our homes, on our arms, in our hearts, to our children, to the next generation. That those aspects that ensure that our commitment is complete, total, constant, consistent, all-encompassing, and that's what makes God part of our lives. Not the theoretical, philosophical ideals, but making sure that they're manifest and lived all the time and everywhere. And that's the key to Shema. Okay, with that, I'll finish week 1 of Shema. I see that there's a few comments, and we'll... Well,
while you look at the comments, first of all, thank you very much. I always think, one of the reasons I think this series is so important is because what we are most familiar with, we often know the least about, in a sense. We know it superficially, but often the most important things are to study what we are familiar with. So, Yasher Koach on part 1, we look forward to parts 2 and 3. Tomorrow, of course, as you mentioned, Benny Gesundheit, Dr. Benny Gesundheit in the morning to Hilim. We hope you'll join between a wonderful series on Tanakh. Mark Shapiro, I believe, is not giving his class tomorrow night. If there's a change, we'll let you know. And then Tuesday night, Shimon Lerner, Dr. Shimon Lerner on Sefer Mishlei. And Wednesday morning, Rivka Blau speaking about her parents, Rabbi and Mrs. Teitz, Rabbi Ted's one of the founders of really American Orthodoxy. So that's Wednesday morning at 11 a.m. Okay, Rabbi Ziring, I think you have maybe time to look at the questions.
Okay, so in the chat, so we will, 1 second, okay. Right, so there is a technical halachic issue that Rabbi Kalman noted. There is a dispute between the Rambam and the Balei HaTosfot whether the mitzvot for which you're not obligated to give up your life, whether you're even allowed to. The Rambam thinks you're not allowed to, and the Balei HaTosfot think in general there are 3 mitzvot for which you're obligated to give up your life, and for every other mitzvah you're allowed to, which is easy, therefore, for the Balei HaTosfot. However, there is another category which may play in here, which is that in times when Judaism is under attack, so then everything becomes Kiddush Hashem. So it could be that these mitzvot, on a halachic plane, the reason that all these mitzvot were, you were allowed to give up your life was because they're all taking place during Roman persecution, and therefore it's a time of shmad, it's a time of where everyone's allowed to give up their life. But even if that's the case, it's telling that the mitzvot, the examples that the Talmud gives, when you go consistently throughout, are the ones that happen to appear in these first paragraphs of Shema, which even if on a halachic level it would have been true of eating kosher and not wearing shatnez or anything else, the fact that the examples that the Talmud chooses to find are those that appear in the first paragraph and even the second paragraph of Shema, I think is, as Schwab notes, quite telling. Okay, I even before the shir had started, someone, Lori Novick, who I know spoke for you recently, told me that when we get to the issue of tzitzit and tefillin more in depth, to reference the piece on her new website, Diracheha, which is halachic issues that relate to women, written by women, and she made sure to remind me that I can do a shout out for those, and I will when we get to tzitzit talk more directly about if these are so central, so why are they not incumbent on everybody? But for people who are already interested in looking at the issue of tefillin and tzitzit, I am now fulfilling my obligation. I did tell Lori that if it came up, you should look at her excellent treatment of it on the Diracheha website.
That's why I sent it to you privately. I wasn't sure if you wanted to address it yet.
Yeah, so I'm going to try to address it either next week or in 2 weeks. But in the meantime, for people who are already interested about that question, her treatment is really excellently done. It integrates both the halachic sources as more of and as well as more of a conversational, philosophical rumination about why the halacha is as it is. And she does it better than I can. So you are free to look there on the Diracheha website. It's really, really a wonderful treatment. And I think those are the questions for today. Yeah. Shema in the morning.
I did raise the other kind of question, if I may, that you're on the contradiction. On the one hand, you can say Shema, it's enough to say Shema in the morning. Obviously, that cannot jive with Vishinantam, knowing
right. So the easiest solution to that, not the only, but the easiest solution is probably that of the Shulchan Aruch Harav of Shneur Zalman of Liadi, right? The first Lubavitcher Rebbe, who says there's 2 mitzvot in Torah, right? There's one mitzvah which is to know all of Torah, right? Yedi'at Torah, and then a limud Torah. So yes, every day, if you only said Shema, then you would never fulfill the obligation to know Torah. But if, theoretically, you already knew the whole Torah, and all that was left was your obligation to make sure you learned, so then you could fulfill that with Shema every morning and every night. But there may be a second obligation to know all of Torah, which obviously requires you to, at some point, learn all of Torah. And in fact, the Ran seems to derive the source for that value from this pasuk, from Vishinantim, of if you have to know the Torah so sharp that you never stutter, that must show you that there's a mitzvah of Yedi'at HaTorah. And that's what the Ran seems to say in Nedarim Daf Chet, and that's how it's elaborated on by the Klosenberger Rebbe in Divrei Yatziv in his Tshuvot and Tshuvot Kuf Chaf, where he says, yes, the mitzvah to learn every day comes from V'agita B'yom V'layla, V'dibarta Bam, etc., but Vishinantim, that you should know the Torah sharply, teaches that second element, which is the obligation to know Torah and not just study it. So I think that's the easiest way of resolving the contradiction. Again, not the only one, but definitely I think the easiest. Okay, I think I got it. Okay, and it's an hour. So thank you everyone for coming. It's a pleasure to study these texts with you, and I look forward to next week when we move to the second theme and zero in more closely on the story of Rabbi Akiva, and that shir will focus mostly on Rabbi Lamb's fascinating analysis of that piece. I feel like we should do at least one piece, Lizichro, but it's not so long after he passed away, and he did write this amazing treatise on Shema. So we're going to focus on his beautiful analysis of the two versions of the Rabbi Akiva story in the Bavli and in the Yerushalmi. So that's what we'll do next week, and then the third week we'll focus on some issues in Tzitzit. Okay. Thank you again for everyone for coming. Thank you, Rabbi Kelman, to Torah in Motion, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.